A year after my devastating divorce, my ex-mother-in-law spotted me at the hospital. With a smug smile, she said, "Leaving you was the best decision my son ever made." I just smiled and asked, "Is that what you truly believe?" 5 minutes later, a man entered the room and her face lost all color. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had the ultimate revenge on a toxic family member who severely underestimated your worth. The VIP wing of Atlanta General Hospital was designed to feel more like a luxury hotel than a medical facility. Soft, ambient lighting replaced the harsh fluorescent glare of the main corridors. The floors were polished marble, and the air smelled faintly of lavender rather than sterile antiseptic. I was standing near the central mahogany reception desk, reviewing a thick medical file. I wore a pair of fitted navy blue surgical scrubs with a tailored cream-colored blazer draped over my shoulders. It was a practical outfit for a woman who spent her morning touring surgical wards and her afternoon negotiating multi-million-dollar acquisitions. But to anyone who did not know who I was or what I had built over the last 12 months, I simply looked like a tired nurse or a low-level hospital clerk. I was 32 years old, and for the first time in my life, I was entirely in control of my own destiny. I was flipping through a budget report for the cardiology department when I heard the sharp, rhythmic clicking of designer heels against the marble floor. I did not need to look up to know who it was. That specific aggressive cadence belonged to only one person, Vivian. She was 58 years old, but spent a small fortune ensuring she looked at least a decade younger. As a prominent member of Atlanta, U.S. exclusive Black elite social circles, Vivian lived for appearances. Her hair was perfectly laid without a single strand out of place. She wore a tailored emerald green dress that screamed old money, accompanied by her signature pearl necklace and a designer handbag that cost more than a reliable used car. She was the kind of woman who commanded attention and demanded submission, especially from those she deemed beneath her social class. For 5 years, I had been her primary target. I was the girl from a working-class neighborhood who had dared to marry her golden boy, Marcus. During my marriage, Vivian never missed a single opportunity to remind me that I lacked the pedigree, the connections, and the financial backing to be a proper wife to her son. I kept my eyes on this medical file as she approached the desk. I assumed she was here to visit a sick friend from her country club, or perhaps attending a consultation. But when her footsteps stopped abruptly, just 3 feet away from me, the silence in the room became heavy. I slowly raised my head and met her gaze. Vivian froze. Her perfectly arched eyebrows shot up in genuine surprise. For a split second, she looked taken aback to see her former daughter-in-law standing in the most exclusive wing of the city, U.S. top hospital. But that surprise vanished almost instantly, quickly replaced by a familiar look of absolute disdain. Her eyes swept up and down my body, taking in the surgical scrubs and the sensible sneakers I wore. In her mind, she had just solved a puzzle. She had calculated my worth based entirely on my attire and placed me squarely at the bottom of the hospital hierarchy. I looked up at my mother. I felt no tears, no heartbreak, just a cold, terrifying clarity. "You forged my signature to steal $90,000 from a bank." "Keep your voice down," my mother hissed, glancing nervously at the closed door of the private room. "We did not steal anything. You have millions of dollars tied up in that tech company of yours. $90,000 is pocket change to you. But to Chloe, it is the difference between a beautiful wedding and a total embarrassment. Preston comes from an elite family, Maya. We cannot look like beggars in front of his relatives. You owe this family." Chloe chimed in, her eyes wide with manufactured innocence. "Maya, please do not be selfish. I already booked the florist and the caterer. If you report this to the police, the funds will be frozen, and you will ruin my $350,000 dream wedding. Why do you always have to be the difficult one? Black women are supposed to uplift each other, but you just want to see me fail." There was no alimony. Marcus had drained our joint savings account and hidden his assets in offshore accounts before serving me with divorce papers. He had left me with absolutely nothing. But Vivian loved to rewrite history to make her son look like a benevolent savior. I did not correct her. I simply stood there, my hands resting casually on the desk, observing her. It was fascinating to watch her operate. Without the emotional blinders of trying to please her, I could finally see Vivian for exactly what she was, a deeply insecure woman who needed to crush others to feel tall. "You always were an embarrassment to our family name," Vivian continued, her voice growing louder, ensuring that the two nurses walking past the lounge could hear her. "Marcus is a brilliant man with a bright future. He needed a wife who could elevate him, not a charity case who dragged him down. Looking at you right now, standing here in cheap medical scrubs, I am just so incredibly grateful that my son woke up and realized you were nothing but dead weight." I let her words hang in the air. I let the silence stretch out between us, giving her enough rope to hang herself. My lack of reaction seemed to confuse her. She was expecting me to cry, to argue, to defend my pride. When I did none of those things, her irritation visibly spiked. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, preparing to deliver the deepest cuts she could muster. "Marcus is doing phenomenally well, in case you were wondering," Vivian said, her tone shifting from mockery to aggressive bragging. "He just closed another massive deal. 6-figure commission in a single afternoon. He is currently looking at purchasing a brand new 6-bedroom mansion in Buckhead. It is a stunning property, Maya. Marble floors, a wine cellar, a massive backyard. Everything he deserves. And his new partner is simply wonderful. She comes from a spectacular family. Her father sits on the board of 3 different banks. She is refined, educated, and she actually knows how to carry herself in high society." She paused, taking a dramatic breath before leaning in closer. Her eyes narrowed into cruel slits. "But most importantly, Maya, she is actually capable of giving me a healthy grandchild. Something you clearly could never do. You were completely unfit to carry the family legacy." The air in the room seemed to turn to ice. Vivian had just weaponized the most traumatic experience of my life. The memory flashed through my mind, unbidden but sharp. A year ago, I had been lying in a sterile hospital bed just like the ones in this very building, bleeding and sobbing after losing my baby at 19 weeks. I had been terrified and entirely alone. Marcus had not been holding my hand. He had not been pacing the waiting room in tears. Marcus had left his phone on silent while he attended a lavish corporate gala with the daughter of a wealthy banking executive. The woman who was now his new partner. I had lost our child while he was busy networking and sleeping with his mistress. When Vivian found out about the miscarriage, she did not offer a single word of comfort. She had simply told Marcus that it was a sign from God that he was meant to be with someone better. Vivian stared at my face, waiting for the tears to fall. She wanted to see me break. She wanted the satisfaction of knowing she still had the power to destroy me with a few carefully chosen words. But I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, calculating clarity. She did not know that the 6-figure deal Marcus supposedly closed was a complete fabrication. She did not know that her golden boy was drowning in secret debt, desperately trying to maintain a facade of wealth to impress his new elite girlfriend. And she certainly did not know that the venture capital firm Marcus was trying to swindle out of millions of dollars was owned entirely by me. I looked at Vivian, my expression completely unbothered. I felt like a scientist studying a predictable and somewhat pathetic lab rat. The venom she spat no longer held any poison. It was just noise from a woman who was entirely oblivious to the fact that her entire world was about to collapse. I tilted my head slightly, keeping my voice incredibly soft and remarkably calm. "Is that what you truly believe, Vivian? Is that the fairy tale you tell yourself to sleep at night?" Vivian opened her mouth to snap back, to deliver another crushing insult, but she never got the chance. Before she could form a single word, the heavy double doors of the VIP lounge burst open with a violent crash. The loud bang echoed off the marble walls, making Vivian jump and spin around. The aggressive interruption shattered the tense silence of our confrontation. It was not a doctor or a security guard who came running through those doors. It was Darren Marcus, us younger brother, and his wife Chloe. They were both out of breath, their faces pale with absolute sheer panic. The petty family drama and the cruel insults were instantly forgotten, replaced by a sudden and very real life or death crisis. Darren gripped the heavy wooden doorframe, his knuckles turning white as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. Chloe was right behind him, her usually pristine blonde hair clinging to her damp forehead. She was clutching her designer tote bag against her chest like a shield, her face completely devoid of its usual arrogant flush. Vivian snapped her attention away from me. The annoyance on her face instantly morphed into sheer maternal alarm. She abandoned her aggressive stance and rushed toward her younger son, her expensive heels clicking frantically against the marble floor. She demanded to know what was going on, asking why they were sprinting through a hospital corridor like lunatics. Darren could barely get the words out. He swallowed hard, his voice cracking as he reached out and grabbed his mother by the shoulders. Marcus collapsed, "Mom." He kept repeating it over and over as if the phrase itself was a foreign language he could not translate. He was at his office. The paramedics said his heart just gave out. It was a massive panic attack that triggered a severe cardiac event. They are wheeling him into emergency bypass surgery right this second. Vivian stumbled backward. The perfectly poised matriarch, who just seconds ago had been ruthlessly boasting about her son, us elite genetics, and untouchable success, let out a guttural, devastating shriek. It was the sound of a woman watching her golden pedestal shatter into a million jagged pieces. She grabbed Darren's suit lapels, shaking him wildly. She screamed that it had to be a mistake. She yelled that Marcus was only 34 years old, that he ran miles every morning, that he was in absolute perfect health. Chloe, trembling and wide-eyed, stepped forward to support her mother-in-law. She told Vivian that the emergency room doctors said his blood pressure had skyrocketed due to an unprecedented level of acute stress. Chloe wiped a tear from her cheek, explaining that something catastrophic had happened at the financial firm this morning. Marcus had received a phone call and simply dropped to the floor, clutching his chest before he could even call out for help. I remained standing by the mahogany reception desk, my posture completely unchanged. My face betrayed absolutely zero emotion. I did not gasp. I did not cover my mouth in shock. I did not rush forward to offer a comforting hand to the woman who had just spent the last 10 minutes verbally tearing me apart. Instead, I simply observed them. I knew exactly what had happened at Marcus's office. The acute stress that caused his heart to fail was no mystery to me. Just 2 hours ago, my venture capital firm, acting in full coordination with federal authorities, had executed a massive asset freeze on all of his fraudulent shell companies. The Golden Boy had watched his multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme evaporate in real time on his computer screen. The sheer terror of knowing that the authorities were literally marching into his corporate lobby had quite literally broken his heart. The VIP lounge transformed instantly from a quiet sanctuary of wealth into a chaotic room of despair. Vivian collapsed onto one of the plush leather sofas, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. Darren paced the floor frantically, running his hands over his head, muttering to himself about how this could ruin their upcoming family investments. The air in the room felt thick and suffocating, the faint smell of lavender completely overpowered by the sharp scent of genuine human panic. For a brief moment, a flicker of a memory crossed my mind. I remembered lying in a hospital bed a year ago, begging the nurses to call Marcus because I was losing our child. I remembered the cold, empty silence of my hospital room, while my husband ignored my calls. I remembered the absolute terror that gripped my chest, a terror very similar to what Vivian was experiencing right now. But the universe has a very strict policy of balancing its scales. The pain they had so carelessly inflicted upon me was now being returned to them with ruthless precision. I felt no pity. I felt no urge to comfort them. I simply watched the tragedy unfold with the detached calculation of a woman who had already mourned the loss of this family a long time ago. Vivian continued to weep loudly, rocking back and forth on the expensive leather sofa. She kept crying out to God, asking why he would allow such a terrible thing to happen to such a good, successful man. She prayed out loud, demanding that the hospital provide the absolute best cardiologists in the state. She promised to donate massive sums of money to the surgical ward if they would just save her precious son. Chloe, trying to maintain some semblance of control, began to look around the room. She was hyperventilating, but her eyes darted furiously, seeking a distraction, seeking a way to assert dominance over a situation where she had absolutely zero power. She needed someone to manage, someone to command, someone to fix the immediate discomfort of her reality. Her frantic blue eyes swept past the automated coffee machine, past the frosted glass windows, and finally landed squarely on me. I was still standing silently near the desk, wearing my dark navy scrubs and my cream blazer. In Chloe, U.S. privileged, terrified mind, I was not an observer. I was the help. The petty insults and the life or death crisis were about to violently collide. So I ask you a single relevant follow-up question. How would you like me to handle Chloe's dialogue in the next section to maximize the contrast between her entitlement and Maya's quiet power? Chloe marched across the polished marble floor. Her designer heels clicked with an erratic, desperate rhythm that completely lacked the practiced elegance of her mother-in-law. She stopped inches from where I stood near the mahogany reception desk. The panic in her eyes had quickly morphed into a volatile, blinding entitlement. She raised her right hand and snapped her manicured fingers directly in my face. The sharp, abrasive sound echoed through the high ceilings of the VIP lounge. "Excuse me," Chloe demanded. Her voice was shrill, echoing with the precise tone of a woman who was entirely accustomed to people bending to her absolute will. "Do not just stand there staring like an idiot. My brother-in-law is experiencing a catastrophic medical emergency. Go into the back room right now and fetch us 3 bottles of sparkling water. And find the head of the surgical department. We need the VIP admission paperwork expedited immediately. Marcus is a priority patient." I did not blink. I did not step back. I simply looked at the fingers she had just snapped in my face. During my marriage to Marcus, Chloe had always treated me with thinly veiled condescension. She had married Darren 2 years before Marcus and I tied the knot. From the moment I was introduced to the family, Chloe made it her personal mission to remind me that I did not belong. She wielded her racial privilege like a hidden dagger, wrapping insults in a sickeningly sweet Southern drawl. She loved to mask blatant disrespect as friendly advice. When I remained perfectly still, Chloe let out a loud, exasperated sigh. She placed one hand on her hip, looking me up and down with absolute revulsion. "I understand the hospital is probably understaffed today," Chloe said, dripping with venom. "But this is the elite wing. We pay thousands of dollars a month for premium care so we do not have to deal with incompetence. I know your people tend to get a little comfortable and lazy when unsupervised, but you are on the clock. You need to tie up that massive hair of yours, look professional, and do your actual job." The jab at my natural's hair was not a surprise. It was a classic Chloe tactic. My hair was styled in a thick, gorgeous crown of natural curls, a stark contrast to the chemically straightened styles Vivian preferred. Chloe had always made backhanded comments about my hair, asking if it was appropriate for corporate dinners, or suggesting I tame it to look more refined. Hearing her weaponize it now in the middle of a hospital while her brother-in-law was having a heart attack on an operating table was a testament to her absolute moral bankruptcy. She needed someone to demean to make herself feel powerful in a moment of total helplessness. Darren stepped up behind his wife. His face was slick with sweat, and he was loosening his expensive silk tie with trembling hands. "What is the holdup, Chloe?" he barked, completely ignoring my presence, as if I were a piece of malfunctioning medical equipment. "We need the forms. We need the chief of cardiology down here right now." "This girl is refusing to do her job," Chloe complained, pointing an accusatory finger at my chest. "She is just standing here, taking up space in a restricted area." I took a slow, deliberate breath. The sheer audacity of these people was truly a marvel to witness. They were standing in my hospital demanding that I serve them, while throwing racist microaggressions in my face. A younger version of me would have felt the familiar sting of tears pricking the back of my eyes. The old Maya would have internalized the insult, wondering if she truly was out of place, if her hair was too loud, if her mere existence was an inconvenience. The old Maya would have rushed to the refrigerator to grab their sparkling water just to de-escalate the tension. But the old Maya was dead. She died the day Marcus left her bleeding in a hospital bed to attend a cocktail party with his mistress. I did not offer them a single word of compliance. I did not explain my position. I did not correct their profoundly arrogant assumptions. Instead, I shifted my weight and turned away from the reception desk entirely. I walked with slow, measured steps toward the center of the lounge. The room was furnished with incredibly expensive tufted leather sofas arranged around a massive glass coffee table. I chose the largest sofa, the one positioned directly in the center of the room, commanding a perfect view of both the emergency double doors and the panicked family standing by the desk. I sat down. The soft premium leather sighed beneath my weight. I smoothed the front of my cream-colored blazer, adjusted the cuffs, and slowly crossed my legs. I leaned back into the plush cushions, resting my arms gracefully on the armrests. I looked exactly like what I was, a billionaire executive taking a momentary break in her own private facility. Chloe gasped. The sound was so loud and dramatic it startled a passing orderly in the hallway. She looked at Darren, then back at me, her face turning a deep shade of crimson. The sheer disrespect of my action, the absolute refusal to bow to her commands, had short-circuited her brain. Vivian, who had been weeping into her hands, looked up from the other sofa. Her tear-streaked face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage when she realized I had not been banished from the room. "Are you out of your mind?" Chloe shrieked, her voice vibrating with hysterical anger. "Get up. Get out of that seat right now. That seating area is strictly reserved for family members and VIP patients. You are a staff member. You are wearing scrubs. How dare you sit down while we are dealing with a family tragedy? Get up and get me the hospital administrator before I ensure you never work in this city again." I kept my posture completely relaxed. I rested my chin on my hand and looked at Chloe with a mild, almost bored expression. The silence I offered them was heavier and more punishing than any insult I could have thrown back. They were drowning in a sea of their own manufactured panic, and I was sitting comfortably on the shore watching the waves pull them under. My absolute refusal to react to her snapping fingers, to her racist jabs, to her frantic demands was breaking her mind. She stepped closer, her fists clenched at her sides, her breathing ragged and shallow. She was preparing to unleash a torrent of threats to exert the full force of her privilege against the black woman she believed was completely powerless. But she had no idea that her threats were completely empty, and her perceived power was nothing but a fragile, dangerous illusion. Darren pushed past his wife, unable to tolerate my silence for another second. He closed the distance between us, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. His expensive silk suit was completely ruined by dark patches of sweat, and his usually perfectly groomed hair was sticking up at odd angles. He looked down at me, sitting comfortably on the premium leather sofa, and his features twisted into a mask of pure ugly contempt. "You are still so incredibly bitter, Maya." Darren spat, his voice dropping an octave as he tried to exert some kind of masculine dominance over the situation. "I cannot believe you would stoop this low. My brother is fighting for his life in an operating room right now, and you are using this tragedy to play some pathetic petty game just because you are still obsessed with him." He stepped closer, invading my personal space, hoping I would shrink back into the cushions. I did not move a single inch. "We all know exactly why you are acting like this," Darren continued, his tone dripping with fake psychoanalysis. "You are angry because Marcus upgraded. You are furious because he left you and built an empire while you are stuck working hourly shifts in a hospital wearing cheap scrubs. But taking your pathetic jealousy out on us during a family emergency is a new low even for you. Get off that sofa right now before I personally drag you up by your arm and have you thrown out onto the street." Chloe, emboldened by her husband taking charge, crossed her arms tightly over her chest. She nodded aggressively, her blue eyes flashing with vindictive delight. "We want the name of your direct supervisor immediately," Chloe demanded. "You have absolutely no idea who you are dealing with. We are prominent donors in this city. Darren and Marcus play golf with the board of directors of this hospital. I guarantee you will not only be fired for insubordination, but I will make sure you are blacklisted from every medical facility in the state of Georgia. You will be lucky if you can find a job scrubbing toilets in a rundown free clinic by tomorrow morning. They stood side by side, a united front of absolute delusion. They were desperately trying to reassert their perceived superiority, pouring all their frantic nervous energy into destroying me because I was the only thing in that room they thought they could control. They could not fix Marcus. They could not stop the federal agents they did not yet know about. But they fully believed they could break me. I let their threats echo through the vast, quiet space of the VIP lounge. I did not offer a single word of defense. I did not try to justify my presence. I simply raised my left hand, resting it gracefully on my knee. The ambient lighting of the lounge caught the face of my watch. It was a custom platinum Rolex Daytona completely encrusted with flawless diamonds. It was a timepiece that cost more than Darren's entire annual salary. A sharp, observant person would have instantly noticed the heavy, blinding wealth resting casually on my wrist. A smart person would have seen that watch paired with tailored scrubs and realized that the narrative in their head was dangerously incorrect. But Darren and Chloe were neither sharp nor smart. They were blinded by their own frantic arrogance. They did not even glance at the watch. They only saw what their prejudice and entitlement allowed them to see: a black woman from a working-class background who was refusing to follow their orders. I glanced down at the Rolex, checking the time with a slow, deliberate movement. I let another 5 seconds pass, watching the second hand sweep across the diamond-studded dial. The intentional delay was a psychological weapon, and I wielded it with absolute precision. Every passing second of my silence made them feel smaller, more insignificant, more infuriated. Finally, I raised my eyes and looked directly into Darren's sweating, flushed face. My voice when I spoke was perfectly modulated, smooth, quiet, and entirely devoid of emotion. "I am not bitter, Darren," I said, pronouncing each word with crisp, careful articulation. "And I am certainly not obsessed with a man who could not even afford the suit he was wearing the day he left me." Darren opened his mouth to shout, but I did not let him interrupt. I held up a single finger, demanding his silence, and surprisingly, he clamped his mouth shut. Furthermore, I continued, my tone remaining dangerously calm. Grabbing 3 bottles of sparkling water and filling out admission paperwork is fundamentally outside the scope of my job description. I highly suggest you go find an actual nurse or perhaps a vending machine if you are that thirsty. You are wasting precious energy yelling at me when you should probably be calling your financial advisors. The sheer disrespect of my statement, the absolute, unbothered way I dismissed their threats as irrelevant noise, hit them like a physical blow. Darren took a step back, his mouth opening and closing as his brain completely failed to process my defiance. Chloe let out a sharp, offended gasp, pressing her hand against her chest as if she had just been struck. But it was Vivian who reacted the most violently. From across the room, Vivian had heard every single word of our exchange. The sight of me sitting relaxed and powerful on that sofa, treating her wealthy, successful son and her privileged daughter-in-law like bothersome gnats, broke the final fragile thread of her sanity. The devastating grief over Marcus's heart attack instantly evaporated, completely incinerated by a volcanic, venomous rage. "How dare you!" Vivian screamed. The matriarch pushed herself off the leather sofa, her face twisted into a mask of pure demonic fury. She stalked across the marble floor, pointing a shaking, manicured finger directly at my face. The absolute refusal to submit to her family's authority was an unforgivable crime in Vivian's eyes. She could not comprehend how I was sitting there so comfortably while her world was burning to the ground. In her mind, I was supposed to be the sacrificial lamb, the convenient punching bag they could use to vent their frustrations. "You arrogant, worthless little nobody!" Vivian shrieked, her voice cracking with hysteria. "You think you can sit there and mock my family? You think because you put on a clean blazer you are suddenly our equal? I am going to destroy you, Maya. I am going to make you regret the day you ever crossed paths with this family." Vivian marched past Darren and Chloe, completely consumed by her desperate need to see me severely punished and publicly humiliated. She bypassed the mahogany reception desk entirely, her eyes locked onto the emergency red intercom telephone mounted on the far wall, a device reserved strictly for major hospital security breaches and immediate physical threats. Her hand slammed against the bright red receiver, ripping it off the hook with a violent, aggressive motion. She was preparing to unleash the full, devastating weight of her perceived power against me, ready to summon an army of guards to drag me out of the building. She was entirely convinced that one phone call would end my miserable little life, but she was completely unaware that she was about to dial her own absolute destruction. Vivian slammed the bright red receiver against her ear, her chest heaving with theatrical gasps. She did not just speak into the emergency intercom, she performed. Security, she shrieked, her voice pitching into a perfect weaponized imitation of a terrified, helpless victim. I need a full security team in the VIP cardiology lounge immediately. There is an unhinged, violent woman in here. She is harassing my family. She is refusing to leave the premises and actively threatening the safety of the critical patients. Send absolutely everyone you have right now before it is too late. She slammed the heavy plastic receiver back onto the wall hook with an aggressive crack. A truly wicked, victorious smile stretched across her tear-stained face as she slowly turned back to face me. Darren immediately stepped forward, his expensive leather shoes squeaking against the polished marble. He planted himself squarely between me and the exit to block any potential escape route. Chloe now pulled her smartphone from her designer tote bag, holding it at chest level with the camera lens pointed directly at my face. She was practically vibrating with the anticipation of recording my humiliation, eager to capture footage of the bitter ex-wife being violently escorted off the premises. They fully expected me to panic. They expected the sudden, terrifying realization of a police response to break my composure, to force me off the plush leather sofa and send me scrambling for the service elevators in a desperate bid for freedom before the authorities arrived. I did absolutely nothing. I did not raise my hands. I did not stand up and flee. I remained seated, my legs crossed, my breathing steady. The cool, conditioned air of the VIP lounge brushed against the diamond face of my Rolex, a silent, heavy testament to the massive reality they were entirely blind to. I watched them gloat, allowing their false sense of victory to inflate their fragile egos to the absolute breaking point. "It is over, Maya," Vivian sneered. "You pushed your luck, and now you are going to pay the ultimate price. They are sending the head of security and a full tactical response team. You will be escorted out of this hospital in handcuffs. I am going to press maximum charges for harassment, and I will personally make sure the local Atlanta news outlets get a copy of the police report." Chloe stepped up right beside her mother-in-law, her phone continuously recording every second of my silence. "You really thought you could pull off this pathetic little stunt and get away with it," Chloe mocked. "You thought you could walk into a premium medical facility wearing cheap scrubs and pretend you have some kind of power over us. You have no class, no sense of boundaries, and absolutely zero future." Darren adjusted his silk cuffs now that he firmly believed an army of security guards was rushing to his aid. "I hope the satisfaction of sitting on that expensive couch was worth it, Maya." He threatened, his voice low and menacing. "Because when those guards get here, I am going to have them search your pockets. People like you always resort to petty theft when you realize you cannot succeed through actual hard work." The sheer volume of their baseless accusations would have been comical if it were not deeply rooted in toxic prejudice. They were actively projecting every vile, racist, and classist stereotype they could muster onto me. They needed me to be a thief. They needed me to be a desperate, unstable ex-wife. Because if I was not a failure, then they would be forced to face the terrifying, inescapable reality of their own profound mediocrity. The seconds ticked by, heavy and suffocating. The three of them stood towering over me, their dark shadows stretching. They waited hungrily for me to beg for mercy. Vivian kept her eyes wide and ravenous, searching my calm face for a single drop of fear. Chloe shifted her weight, eager for the physical violence of my removal. Darren stood tall, playing the role of the valiant, wealthy protector defending his incredibly elite family. I met Vivian's hungry stare with a look of absolute chilling indifference. "You are making a spectacular miscalculation," I said, my voice cutting through their hostile silence like a razor blade. "But by all means, let us wait for security. I am quite curious to see exactly how this plays out today. Shut up. Vivian spat a droplet of saliva flying from her quivering lips. Do not speak to me. You do not have the right to speak to me anymore. You are nothing but a massive mistake my son made. The sound began. It started as a faint rhythmic thudding echoing down the long polished corridor leading directly to the VIP cardiology wing. Heavy, purposeful, rapid footsteps. Not just one person, but several. The unmistakable synchronized march of a fully equipped security detail responding to a code-red emergency call aggressively hitting the marble tile. The sound grew significantly louder with every passing second echoing through the thick mahogany double doors. Darren stood up even straighter. Chloe raised her smartphone higher, her thumb pressing firmly on the screen, ready to capture the exact moment they dragged me aggressively off the premium leather cushions. Vivian took a deep, shuddering, dramatic breath, smoothing down the front of her emerald green dress, preparing to play the perfect traumatized elite matriarch, seeking salvation. The running footsteps reached the threshold. The tension in the room snapped tight, pulling the atmosphere to its absolute breaking point. The heavy brass handles of the double doors began to turn downward, signaling the immediate arrival of the powerful, disciplined force Vivian had summoned to completely destroy me. She stood there, smiling blindly, waiting for my absolute downfall, blissfully unaware that she had just aggressively called the very people exclusively employed to protect me from women exactly like her. The heavy mahogany doors flew open with a violent crash. Two massive armed security guards charged into the VIP lounge. Their boots slammed against the marble floor, stopping just inside the room. They rested their hands on their belts, scanning for the unhinged threat. The head of hospital security, Chief Miller, led the charge. He carried an air of absolute authority. Vivian did not waste a single second. She lunged across the space, stepping aggressively toward the guards while maintaining a safe distance from me. She threw her arm out, pointing a shaking, manicured finger directly at my face. Her voice was shrill, echoing with a manufactured terror that was impressive in its execution. "Thank God you are here," Vivian cried, clutching her diamond necklace. "This woman has lost her mind." She breached the VIP wing and is actively harassing my family. My son is in emergency bypass surgery, and this bitter stalker is refusing to leave. She is a danger to us and the patients. I demand you remove the trash immediately. Arrest her and drag her out before she hurts someone. Darren puffed out his chest, standing proudly behind his mother. "You heard the woman?" Darren barked, his tone dripping with the expectation of immediate compliance. "Secure the perimeter and get her out of my sight. My wife is recording this entire interaction, so I highly suggest you do your jobs efficiently." Chloe held her smartphone higher, panning the camera lens between the security guards and my seated form. The stage was perfectly set. The wealthy, prominent family had given their absolute command. I was the lone black woman sitting silently in the center of the lounge, wearing surgical scrubs. According to every social script Vivian relied upon, I was supposed to be snatched from the sofa and thrown into a police cruiser. But the script fractured. Chief Miller followed the trajectory of Vivian's shaking finger. His tactical gaze swept across the room and landed directly on me. I remained perfectly still, my legs gracefully crossed, my hands resting softly on my lap. I looked up at the towering head of security and offered him a small, tight-lipped smile. Chief Miller froze. The intense combative adrenaline evaporated in an instant. All the color drained rapidly from his weathered face, leaving him looking like a man who had stepped onto a live landmine. He immediately dropped his hand from his tactical belt and swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. The second guard stopped dead in his tracks. He looked at Chief Miller, then looked at me, and his eyes widened in unfiltered panic. He quickly took a step back, lowering his head in a gesture of profound respect that went entirely unnoticed by my screaming former-in-laws. "What are you waiting for?" Vivian shrieked, her voice pitching higher. "I gave you a direct order. Grab her by the arms and haul her out of here. Do I need to call the local police precinct myself? I will have your badges revoked by dinner time if you do not put your hands on her right now." Chief Miller did not move a muscle toward me. Instead, he turned his pale face slowly toward Vivian. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The head of security for the most prestigious medical facility in Atlanta was speechless. He stammered, shifting his weight uncomfortably, looking desperately between the raging matriarch and the calm woman sitting on the sofa. Ma'am, Chief Miller finally choked out his voice, lacking its usual commanding resonance. I cannot do that. We cannot remove her. Vivian's jaw dropped. The sheer absurdity of a guard refusing her direct demand short-circuited her brain. What did you just say to me? Vivian gasped. Are you incompetent? She is trespassing. She is threatening us. Grab her. Darren stepped forward, his face flushing with a new wave of indignant fury. Listen to me, you useless rent-a-cop, Darren spat, closing the distance. My family donates millions to this city. We are premium patients. If you do not physically remove this woman this exact second, I will personally ensure you are fired and sued for negligence. The guard stood their ground. Chief Miller looked directly at me, his eyes silently pleading for instruction on how to handle the hysterical family screaming in his face. I maintained my silence. I wanted them to sit in this agonizing confusion. I wanted Vivian to feel the absolute terror of realizing her privilege was failing her. I gave Chief Miller a nearly imperceptible shake of my head, a tiny motion commanding him to stand down and let them dig their own graves. Chief Miller instantly understood the assignment. He straightened his posture, clasped his hands behind his back, and looked at Darren. I apologize for your distress, sir, Chief Miller said carefully. But I cannot and will not lay a hand on that woman. My team will remain stationed by the doors to ensure safety, but we will not be escorting her from the premises. The arrogance blinding my former family was spectacular. Faced with the reality that these guards recognized a higher authority, they completely failed to connect the dots. They did not look at my diamond watch. They did not wonder why an armed security chief was terrified to cross me. Their prejudice simply concluded the guards were utterly incompetent. This is an absolute outrage, Chloe yelled, her camera still recording. You are letting this trash intimidate you. Just wait until the hospital board hears about this massive failure. You are losing your jobs today. Fine, Vivian declared, spinning around to glare at me with murderous intent. If the pathetic security guards are too cowardly to do their actual jobs, then we will handle this ourselves. She turned back to the mahogany reception desk, snatching a blank hospital form and gripping a pen with white knuckles. She was entirely consumed by the delusion that she was still the most powerful person in the room. The guards remained frozen by the door, watching the catastrophic spectacle unfold. They knew exactly who I was, and they were mesmerized by the spectacular display of disrespect directed at the woman who signed their paychecks. Darren shoved his way past his mother, physically moving Vivian aside to take control of the catastrophic embarrassment unfolding in the VIP lounge. He adjusted his ruined silk tie, straightening his shoulders in a desperate bid to project ultimate masculine authority. He let out a harsh scoff, shaking his head at Vivian, as if her financial failure was merely a trivial inconvenience that he, the highly successful corporate savior, was uniquely equipped to solve. Mom, please stop screaming at the billing director, Darren ordered, his tone dripping with the arrogant certainty of a man who had never faced a single real consequence in his entire life. You are making a massive scene over a simple banking glitch. Your account was probably flagged for suspicious activity because you rarely make six-figure transactions in person. Let the adults handle this. Darren reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and withdrew a sleek silver wallet. He pulled out a heavy platinum corporate card, letting it catch the light. This was the card tied to his supposedly untouchable wealth, the card he used to fund his lavish lifestyle and impress Chloe's country club friends. He slapped it onto Mr. Sterling's silver clipboard with an aggressive thud. Run this one, Darren commanded, lifting his chin and staring down the billing director. There is more than enough liquidity in my corporate accounts to cover Marcus's surgery deposit 10 times over. I want my brother on the operating table in the next 2 minutes, and I want you to personally ensure his room is upgraded to the Presidential Recovery Suite to compensate for this utterly ridiculous administrative delay. Mr. Sterling did not blink. He smoothly retrieved Darren's platinum card from the clipboard and inserted it into the mobile payment terminal. The machine processed the chip. Darren stood tall, crossing his arms over his chest, throwing a triumphant glare in my direction. He fully expected me to cower at the display of his boundless financial superiority. He wanted me to witness firsthand how completely insignificant I was, compared to the unstoppable financial juggernaut of his family. The payment terminal let out a sharp, aggressive beep. A bright red error message illuminated the digital screen, casting a faint crimson glow against Mr. Sterling's crisp white shirt. The billing director did not even attempt to run it a second time. He simply pulled the card from the slot and held it out toward Darren, his expression devoid of any sympathy or surprise. "I am afraid your card has also been rejected, sir," Mr. Sterling stated, his voice maintaining its flat professional cadence. "The system is returning the exact same hard block code that your mother's card generated. Your financial institution is denying the transaction." Darren's smug expression evaporated instantly. He snatched the platinum card from Mr. Sterling's hand, staring at the piece of metal as if it had just betrayed him. "That is completely impossible." Darren sputtered, his voice cracking slightly. "That is my primary corporate account. There are massive capital reserves sitting there. Run it again. The chip is probably dirty. Run it as credit. Bypass the security pin. Do whatever you have to do to make the charge go through." Mr. Sterling complied without a single word of protest. He swiped the magnetic strip. Beep. Declined. He manually entered the long sequence of account numbers, overriding the chip requirement. Beep. Declined. The sharp red error messages flashed across the screen in rapid succession, a brutal rhythmic denial of Darren's entire reality. Darren took a stumbling step backward, his chest heaving as the panic violently clawed its way up his throat. He looked at the card, then at his mother, whose face was still buried in her hands. The pristine illusion of his bulletproof wealth was aggressively fracturing. Chloe let out an exasperated sigh, stepping forward to push her husband out of the way. "You are both being completely ridiculous," Chloe snapped, rolling her blue eyes in absolute frustration. "You probably missed a payment or triggered some ridiculous automated security threshold. This is exactly why I keep my trust fund completely separate from your business accounts, Darren. I am not going to let Marcus die while you two play games with your bank managers." Chloe unzipped her designer tote bag and aggressively pulled out her own luxury credit card. It was a premium card linked to her wealthy family's generational assets. She shoved it directly into Mr. Sterling's hand, glaring at me from across the room to ensure I was watching her play the ultimate savior. "Use mine," Chloe demanded, tossing her blonde hair over her shoulder. "And do it quickly." Mr. Sterling inserted Chloe's card into the terminal. The machine whirred, its digital brain processing the request. Chloe stood with one hand on her hip, exuding the supreme confidence of a woman whose financial safety net had never once failed her. Beep. The red light flashed again. Mr. Sterling slowly pulled the card from the slot. He looked directly into Chloe's widening eyes. "Declined, madam," he announced. "The error code is identical to the previous two attempts. Your primary banking institution has completely locked the account." Chloe let out a strangled gasp. She snatched the card back, her hands shaking violently. "No, no, no, that is my personal account," she shrieked, her southern drawl pitching into a terrified wail. "That money has absolutely nothing to do with Darren or Vivian. Run it again. Run it right now." "It is not a system glitch," Mr. Sterling said, lowering the terminal. "The terminal is communicating perfectly with the banking servers. The banks themselves are returning a specific lock code. This is an absolute freeze placed on all associated financial profiles." The terrible truth finally crashed into the VIP lounge. The family was not experiencing a random banking error. They were experiencing a coordinated, catastrophic financial contagion. The realization hit them simultaneously, spreading like a highly contagious virus through the room. They had entirely lost access to their money. All of it. At the exact same time. Darren ripped his smartphone from his pocket. His hands were shaking so severely he dropped the device onto the marble floor. He scrambled to pick it up, frantically typing his passcode to open his banking application. Chloe was doing the exact same thing, digging into her tote bag and frantically unlocking her screen. Vivian raised her head, her tear-streaked face pale as a ghost as she fumbled with her own device. I sat perfectly still on the plush leather sofa, watching the magnificent horror unfold. Darren's screen loaded. The bright green interface of his primary banking application appeared, but the numbers showing his account balances were completely gone. In their place, a massive, solid red banner stretched across the digital display. The bold white text was unmistakable and utterly devastating. Account frozen. Please contact your branch manager immediately. Darren let out a suffocated, horrifying sound. He frantically switched to his secondary investment portfolio app. Frozen. He checked his offshore holding accounts. Frozen. Every single digital vault containing his vast wealth was aggressively locked down, returning the exact same terrifying red banner. "Mine is locked too," Chloe screamed, her voice shattering the quiet lounge. She shoved her phone screen into Darren's face, tears of absolute panic streaming down her flushed cheeks. "Everything is gone, Darren. The trust fund, the joint accounts, the emergency credit lines. Everything is frozen. I cannot access a single dollar." Vivian let out a long, agonizing wail, staring blankly at her own glowing screen. The empire she had built, the massive wealth she had relentlessly used to crush me, to humiliate me, to assert her dominance over my life, had completely vanished into thin air. They were utterly trapped, standing in the elite wing of an expensive hospital, entirely unable to pay for a life-saving surgery. They were completely and totally broke. The oppressive silence in the VIP lounge was suddenly broken by the sharp ringing of Mr. Sterling's secure hospital radio. He pulled the heavy black device from his belt and brought it to his ear, stepping a few paces away from the hyperventilating family. His eyes remained fixed on Vivian as he listened to the voice on the other end. I watched his posture stiffen, his professional demeanor shifting into something far more severe. The brief conversation lasted less than 30 seconds, but the gravity of the message completely altered the atmosphere in the room. Mr. Sterling lowered the radio and walked back toward the center of the lounge. His silver clipboard hung loosely at his side, no longer a tool for billing, but a prop in a much larger, more devastating scenario. "Madam," he said, his voice cutting through the sounds of Chloe's frantic weeping and Darren's aggressive tapping on his dead smartphone screen. "I have just received a direct communication from the hospital legal and compliance department regarding your son's insurance profile." Vivian snapped her head up, her eyes bloodshot and wild. "Fix it!" she hissed, her voice raspy and desperate. "Call the insurance board and tell them we are premier clients. Tell them I will personally write a check the absolute second my banking app comes back online. Do not stand there giving me excuses while my son is dying." "It is not an insurance issue, madam," Mr. Sterling replied, his words cold and incredibly precise. "The legal department has informed me that Marcus's entire health coverage policy, along with all associated financial profiles, has been immediately suspended by a direct federal mandate." Darren froze, his thumb hovering over his useless phone screen. "What did you just say?" Darren choked out, the color draining completely from his already pale face. "What do you mean, a federal mandate?" Mr. Sterling did not blink. The United States Federal Bureau of Investigation has executed a coordinated asset freeze on Marcus and all affiliated corporate entities. The federal agents issued a hard lock on his medical coverage, identifying it as a policy funded by illicit corporate assets. "We are legally prohibited from proceeding with the bypass surgery under this specific insurance policy. The FBI has essentially categorized your son's entire financial existence as evidence in an active criminal investigation." The three letters hung in the air like a physical blow. FBI. The elite facade the family had spent decades meticulously building completely disintegrated into dust. Darren staggered backward, his legs giving out completely as he collapsed onto the edge of the leather sofa next to his mother. He stared blankly at the marble floor, his mind violently attempting to process the reality that his brother, the golden boy of Atlanta financial sector, was the target of a federal raid. Chloe dropped her designer tote bag, spilling her expensive cosmetics and useless platinum cards across the pristine floor. She let out a whimpering, horrified gasp, covering her mouth with both hands, as the absolute certainty of public ruin, social exile, and potential criminal association crashed over her. But Vivian refused to accept reality. The matriarch, whose entire identity was entirely dependent on the flawless perfection of her wealthy son, actively rejected the facts presented to her. Her brain aggressively, forcefully rewrote the narrative in real time, building a completely delusional alternate reality to protect her fragile ego from the devastating truth. She slowly pushed herself off the sofa, her body trembling violently. She did not look at Mr. Sterling. She did not look at her panicking son or her weeping daughter-in-law. She turned her wild, ravenous eyes directly toward me. "It is you!" Vivian shrieked, raising a shaking manicured finger to point squarely at my face. "You did this, you psychotic, jealous little nobody." I remained perfectly still, maintaining my calm, detached expression. I let her delusion fuel her spectacular breakdown. "You hacked the system!" Vivian screamed, her voice echoing down the corridor, her spittle flying through the air. "You work in this hospital. You have access to the medical records and the billing network. You used your pathetic little desk job to plant false flags on Marcus's insurance. You initiated a fake federal lock just to humiliate us because you could not stand watching him succeed without you. You are trying to murder him out of pure bitter spite." Darren looked up, his desperate mind eager to grasp any lifeline, any explanation that did not involve federal prison. "Mom is right," Darren yelled, standing up to join her ridiculous crusade. "You work here, Maya. You manipulated the system to freeze our accounts and block his surgery. This is criminal sabotage. I am going to have you locked in a federal penitentiary for the rest of your miserable life." The absolute sheer magnitude of their delusion was breathtaking. They genuinely believed a black woman wearing surgical scrubs possessed the supreme technological capability to single-handedly freeze multiple national banking institutions and impersonate the Federal Bureau of Investigation just to win a petty family argument. Their deeply ingrained prejudice blinded them to the impossibility of their own accusations. They needed me to be the villain because the alternative, that Marcus was a colossal failure and a criminal, was a truth that would completely destroy them. Chloe suddenly found her voice, stepping forward to join the collective madness. "Yes!" Chloe shrieked, wiping her tear-stained face. "We know the board members. We attend their charity galas. When they find out a bitter ex-wife is using their hospital computers to run a personal vendetta against a wealthy family, they will drag her out of here themselves. You are finished, Maya. You are completely and totally finished." Vivian turned her manic fury back to Mr. Sterling. "I demand to speak to the chairman of the hospital board this exact second," Vivian commanded, stomping her heel against the marble tile. "I have elite connections in this city. I know the people who fund this very building. When I tell them that one of their low-level clerks is actively sabotaging premium patients and impersonating federal agents to commit medical murder, she will not just be fired, she will be utterly destroyed. Go get the chairman right now." I looked at the three of them, standing shoulder to shoulder in their ruined designer clothes, screaming baseless accusations into the quiet air of the VIP lounge. They were a portrait of absolute pathetic desperation. They had convinced themselves that their country club memberships and their perceived social dominance would act as an impenetrable shield against reality. They were loudly demanding the presence of the highest authority in the hospital, fully expecting that authority to bow to their demands and validate their toxic bigotry. I did not offer a single word of defense. I simply smoothed the fabric of my cream-colored blazer and watched them dig their graves deeper. I knew exactly who the chairman of the hospital board was. I knew exactly where he was. And I knew that when he walked through those double doors, the fragile, delusional world Vivian had constructed would be violently and permanently obliterated. The heavy mahogany double doors at the far end of the VIP cardiology lounge did not just open. They were pushed apart with a synchronized, forceful momentum that instantly sucked all the remaining oxygen out of the room. The frantic shouting from my former in-laws died in their throats as an undeniable wave of absolute power rolled across the polished marble floor. A phalanx of 6 men and women dressed in razor-sharp charcoal and black suits marched into the space, operating with the ruthless precision of a corporate military unit. At the absolute center of this formidable formation walked Julian Pierce. Julian was 40 years old and possessed the kind of breathtaking, intimidating wealth that did not require shouting to be recognized. He wore a bespoke midnight blue suit that cost more than Marcus earned in a solid year. His posture was rigid, his jawline carved from granite, and his dark eyes swept the room with the cold, calculating efficiency of an apex predator. He was a notorious billionaire venture capitalist, the newly appointed chairman of the hospital board, and the man I was going to marry. The sheer gravitational pull of his entrance completely altered the physical atmosphere of the lounge. The hospital security team, led by Chief Miller, instantly snapped to attention, straightening their backs and lowering their heads in absolute deference to the man who controlled their entire livelihood. Vivian, who had been screaming until her vocal cords were raw, experienced a magnificent and terrifying psychological transformation. The manic, aggressive fury melted off her face in a fraction of a second, completely replaced by the practiced, fragile mask of a wealthy, victimized matriarch. It was a spectacular display of social sociopathy. She aggressively smoothed the front of her wrinkled emerald green dress, quickly wiped the smeared mascara from under her eyes, and forced her trembling lips into a tight, trembling smile of relief. In Vivian's deeply delusional mind, Julian Pierce was her ultimate salvation. He was a fellow member of the elite upper crust, the supreme authority figure who would immediately recognize her country club pedigree and validate her horrific behavior. She fully believed that his arrival meant her chaotic nightmare was finally over. Vivian stepped forward eagerly, abandoning her son's side. She practically threw herself into Julian's direct path, extending her manicured hand in a pathetic display of forced familiarity. "Oh, Mr. Pierce!" Vivian gasped, pitching her voice into a breathless, tragic flutter. "Thank God you are here. I am Vivian Marcus's mother. We met briefly at the Botanical Society charity gala last spring. My family is experiencing a catastrophic tragedy right now, and your staff is treating us with absolute barbaric disrespect." She did not wait for Julian to respond. She immediately turned her body to point a shaking, accusing finger directly at me, where I remained seated perfectly still on the leather sofa. "That woman sitting over there is a disgruntled, unhinged clerk," Vivian cried out, playing the victim role with sickening perfection. "She has breached this secure facility and is using her low-level computer access to sabotage my son's life-saving surgery. She is impersonating federal agents and blocking our financial transactions to exact a petty personal revenge against my family. I demand that you have her arrested and removed from this hospital immediately. She needs to be placed in federal custody before she murders my boy." Darren, desperately trying to salvage his shattered masculine pride, stepped up right behind his mother. He attempted to project the aura of a high-powered executive, nodding firmly at Julian. "It is a complete disgrace," Sir Darren added, his voice dripping with faux professionalism. "We are premium donors and clients. We expect you to handle this gross insubordination with maximum prejudice. Have your security team drag her out of here right now so we can save my brother." Chloe held her smartphone tightly against her chest, nodding enthusiastically, entirely convinced that the powerful billionaire would instantly side with their wealthy white presenting proximity and crush the black woman sitting on the couch. Julian Pierce did not slow his pace. He did not break his stride. He did not offer Vivian a polite nod, a sympathetic smile, or a single word of comfort. He looked completely right through her. He treated the frantic, desperate matriarch as if she were nothing more than a pane of dirty glass obstructing his path. He did not even glance down at the hand she had extended toward him. The rejection was so absolute, so profoundly freezing, that Vivian's outstretched hand hovered in the empty air, trembling uselessly as Julian walked straight past her. The brutal physical dismissal struck Vivian like a physical blow to the chest. She gasped, stepping back awkwardly as Julian's legal team marched past her, completely ignoring her existence. Darren puffed out his chest, preparing to demand respect, but the sheer intimidating proximity of Julian's silent, ruthless approach forced him to instinctively step backward. Darren retreated, yielding the floor, entirely emasculated and terrified by the unspoken power radiating from the billionaire. Chloe shrank behind her husband, her blue eyes widening in sudden, unadulterated fear as the narrative in her head began to violently collapse. Julian walked directly toward the center of the room. He stopped right in front of the plush leather sofa where I was seated. The entire VIP lounge went dead silent. The security guards held their breath. Mr. Sterling, the billing director, stood perfectly still. The only sound was the frantic, ragged breathing of my former family as they watched the chairman of the board loom over the woman they believed was a worthless minimum wage clerk. Julian looked down at me. The cold, predatory hardness in his eyes instantly vanished, replaced by a warmth and profound respect that made the air in the room crackle with electric tension. He reached into his suit jacket and unbuttoned it smoothly. He leaned down toward me. He did not yell. He did not scold me. He leaned in and pressed a soft, tender kiss directly onto my forehead. When he pulled back, he reached out his right hand. One of the sharp-suited executives standing immediately behind him placed a thick, heavy, leather-bound portfolio into his palm. Julian held the portfolio out, offering it to me with a slight respectful bow of his head. The gesture was unmistakable. It was not a boss handing a file to an employee. It was a partner delivering a critical asset to an equal. Vivian's jaw unhinged. Her eyes bulged from her skull as she watched the most powerful man in the hospital treat the woman she had abused for 5 years with absolute staggering reverence. I slowly reached out and took the leather portfolio from Julian's hand. I did not open it immediately. I rested it on my lap, my diamond Rolex flashing under the ambient light. I looked past Julian, making direct eye contact with Vivian, Darren, and Chloe. Their faces were completely drained of color, resembling absolute ghosts trapped in a nightmare they could not wake up from. The silence in the room stretched, pulling taut like a wire about to snap. They could not process what they were witnessing. Their brains completely rejected the visual evidence of Julian Pierce standing as my protector and my equal. In their minds, I was still the poor girl from a working-class neighborhood who was never good enough for Marcus. They desperately wanted this to be some bizarre misunderstanding. They prayed that Julian had simply mistaken me for someone else. But the heavy, terrifying reality was rapidly settling into their bones. They were standing in a restricted elite medical facility, stripped of their finances, stripped of their dignity, and staring directly at the architect of their total destruction. The game was entirely over, and I was holding all the cards. Julian broke the suffocating silence. His voice was deep and resonant, carrying absolute authority across the room. He did not look at Vivian or Darren. His attention remained entirely focused on me. Madam Chairwoman Julian said, articulating the title with deliberate respect. The final acquisition documents have been fully executed. The purchase of Atlanta General Hospital by our healthcare venture capital firm is now 100% complete. You officially own this facility and its entire operating network. The words dropped into the VIP lounge like heavy stones, shattering the last remaining fragments of Vivian's delusional world. Julian turned his head slightly, finally acknowledging the terrified family standing just a few feet away. Given the current medical crisis involving your former husband, Julian continued, his tone shifting to pure business. I need your executive directive. How would you like to handle the patient, Marcus? The collective gasp from my former family was audible. The realization crashed down upon them with the force of a freight train. The woman they had been aggressively mocking, the black woman they assumed was a low-level hospital clerk, was not just an executive. She was the absolute owner of the very building they were standing in. The premium VIP suite they were begging for, the elite medical staff they were demanding, the very floors they were standing on, belonged entirely to me. Vivian stumbled backward, her legs finally giving out. She collapsed heavily onto the adjacent sofa, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The perfectly maintained facade of the wealthy elite matriarch was completely annihilated. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a horrific realization that she had just spent the last 20 minutes hurling racist and classist insults at a billionaire who literally held her son's life in her hands. Chloe was the first to attempt damage control, her survival instincts overriding her arrogance. The blonde woman desperately tried to backtrack, her face flushing a deep, painful crimson. She took a tentative step forward, her hands raised in a placating gesture. Maya, she stammered, her thick southern drawl returning in full force. Maya, please, you have to understand we were just so incredibly worried about Marcus. We were not thinking straight. The stress of the situation just made us act completely out of character. You know I have always admired your natural hair. It is so beautiful. I was just upset and I misspoke. We are family, Maya. We are all family here. I stood up from the plush leather sofa. The movement was slow, smooth, and completely unbothered. I smoothed the front of my cream-colored blazer and looked down at my dark navy surgical scrubs. I did not raise my voice, but the absolute coldness in my tone commanded the attention of every single person in the lounge. I am wearing these scrubs, Chloe, I explained, my voice slicing through her pathetic attempts at flattery, because I spent the last 3 hours personally inspecting the sterile environments of my newly acquired surgical wards. I wanted to ensure that the millions of dollars I am investing into this facility are being utilized to maintain the absolute highest standards of medical care. I do not fetch water. I do not clean floors. I buy the floors. And I certainly do not consider any of you to be my family. Darren looked absolutely terrified. The arrogant corporate executive who had threatened to have me dragged out by security was now trembling violently. He realized with devastating clarity that his own financial ruin was somehow connected to the immense power I now wielded. The federal asset freeze, the FBI raid, the complete collapse of his brother's empire, all of it was starting to align in his frantic mind. Maya, please, Darren begged, his voice cracking as he took a step toward me. Please, you have to tell Julian to call off the federal agents. Whatever Marcus did, whatever mistakes he made with his company, you cannot let him die on that operating table. You have the power to fix this. You own the hospital. Just authorize the bypass surgery and tell the billing director to waive the deposit. We will pay you back. I swear to God, we will pay you back every single cent. I opened the heavy leather portfolio Julian had handed me. Inside were the comprehensive financial reports detailing the exact scope of Marcus' fraudulent activities. I looked at the pages, then looked back at Darren. Your brother is not a successful financier, Darren, I stated plainly, delivering the truth they had desperately tried to ignore. He has been running a massive multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme for the last 3 years. He used illegal corporate funds to pay for his luxury cars, his country club memberships, and his mistresses. He built a house of cards, and today it completely collapsed. Vivian let out a sharp, agonizing wail. She pressed her hands to her temples, actively refusing to accept the reality of her son's criminal behavior. It is a lie, Vivian shrieked, her voice hoarse and desperate. My son is a good man. He is a brilliant investor. You are just saying these horrible things to punish us. You fabricated these charges because you are still jealous of his new partner. You used your money to buy this hospital and frame him. Julian stepped forward, placing himself firmly between me and Vivian. His presence alone forced the hysterical woman to shrink back into the sofa. Maya did not frame your son, Julian said, his voice deadly calm. Your son was foolish enough to attempt to defraud a massive corporate holding company. He created fake financial portfolios and presented them to investors, hoping to secure millions in venture capital to cover his massive mounting debts. What Marcus did not realize was that the holding company he tried to scam was a direct subsidiary of our primary investment firm. The revelation hit the room like a physical shockwave today. Julian continued speaking, his voice slicing through the heavy silence of the room. When my financial team uncovered the massive irregularities in Marcus's proposals, we immediately traced the shell companies back to his primary accounts. Maya was the one who authorized the deep dive investigation. Maya was the one who handed the complete, undeniable dossier of your son's federal crimes directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation at 6 o'clock this morning. Darren stumbled back, collapsing completely onto the leather sofa beside his mother. His hands gripped his hair as he rocked back and forth, muttering under his breath. The realization that Maya, the woman they had spent the entire morning degrading, was the architect of their total destruction, completely short-circuited his brain. He was a co-signer on several of Marcus's corporate accounts. Darren knew with terrifying certainty that the federal freeze would not stop with his brother. His own assets, his own career, and his own freedom were actively disintegrating. Chloe realized this exact same fact at the exact same moment. The blonde woman stood frozen, holding her designer smartphone. Her blue eyes darted rapidly between Julie and Maya, and finally landed on her husband Darren. The calculation happening in her mind was visible. Chloe came from old Southern money. Her family valued their pristine reputation above absolutely everything else. The thought of being associated with a high-profile federal financial crime, the thought of having her trust fund scrutinized by federal agents or her face plastered across the evening news as the sister-in-law of a convicted felon broke her completely. Her survival instinct overrode any lingering loyalty she had to her husband's family. Chloe shoved her smartphone deep into her designer tote bag and zipped it shut with an aggressive, violent motion. She took 2 large steps away from Darren, physically distancing herself from the radioactive fallout of the family name. "Are you insane?" Chloe shrieked, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at Darren. "You told me Marcus was a genius. You told me your family's investment firm was completely bulletproof. You tied our joint accounts to his holding companies, Darren. You linked my name to a federal Ponzi scheme." Darren looked up at his wife, his face slick with cold sweat. "Chloe, please," he begged, raising his shaking hands. "We can figure this out. I did not know what he was doing. I swear to God I had no idea Marcus was faking the portfolios. We just need to hire the right lawyers and distance ourselves from his operations." "You are going to hire lawyers with what money?" Chloe laughed, a harsh, hysterical sound that echoed sharply against the marble walls. "Your accounts are frozen, Darren. My accounts are frozen. The FBI is literally raiding your brother's office right now, and you want me to stick around and figure it out? Absolutely not. I am not going to federal prison because your family consists of arrogant criminal failures." Vivian gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. "Chloe, how dare you speak to your husband this way?" Vivian cried, trying to summon her broken matriarchal authority. "We are family. We have to stand united against these false accusations." "Shut up, Vivian," Chloe snapped, turning her vicious entitlement fully onto her mother-in-law. "Just shut your mouth for 1 single second. This entire nightmare is your fault. You raised 2 pathetic, incompetent sons and spent your entire life pretending they were gods. You pushed Marcus to live completely beyond his means just so you could brag to your pathetic country club friends. Well, look at your golden boy now, Vivian. He is a broke federal criminal dying on an operating table, and your precious family legacy is absolute garbage." Darren stood up, trying to grab his wife's arm. "Chloe, stop it," he pleaded. "Do not touch me," Chloe screamed, jerking her arm away with violent disgust. "I am leaving. I am calling my father right now and having his legal team draft divorce papers before the end of the day. I am filing for an emergency separation of assets, and I'm going to make sure the federal government knows I had absolutely zero involvement in your pathetic family's financial crimes. Have a nice life in prison, Darren." Chloe turned on her expensive heels and marched directly toward the heavy mahogany doors. She did not look back. She did not spare a single glance at the weeping matriarch or her hyperventilating husband. The heavy doors swung shut behind her, sealing the permanent fracture of their elite family structure. The rats were fleeing the sinking ship, and Chloe was leading the charge. Julian watched the door close before turning his attention back to the ruined family. He checked his diamond watch with complete nonchalance. Just to clarify the situation further, Julian stated smoothly, "Federal agents are currently stationed outside the surgical suite. The absolute second Marcus is stabilized and cleared by the medical team, he will be handcuffed to his recovery bed and officially placed under federal arrest." The final blow landed. Vivian let out a sound that was barely human, a deep guttural wail of absolute defeat. The proud, arrogant woman who had marched into the VIP lounge, demanding compliance and respect, completely shattered. Her legs gave way and she dropped from the edge of the leather sofa, sliding down until her knees hit the cold, hard marble floor. The matriarch of the elite Atlanta social scene was kneeling at my feet. "Maya, please," Vivian sobbed, crawling forward on her knees until she was inches from my shoes. Her perfect hair was a mess, her expensive mascara running in dark black streaks down her flushed cheeks. Please, Maya, I am begging you. You cannot let them take my boy to prison. He will not survive it. He is weak, Maya. He cannot handle a federal penitentiary. She reached out, wrapping her trembling hands around my ankles, her diamond rings digging into the fabric of my scrubs. I know I was cruel to you. Vivian wept, her voice completely broken, entirely devoid of the venom she had wielded for 5 years. I know I said horrible, unforgivable things. I was wrong, Maya. I was so incredibly wrong about you. But please, you have the power to stop this. You own the hospital. You own the company he stole from. You can drop the charges. You can tell the FBI it was a misunderstanding. Please, Maya, I am begging you on my hands and knees. We used to be family. Do not let my son die in a cage. I looked down at the woman weeping at my feet. I felt the cold, smooth face of my Rolex against my wrist. I felt Julian standing tall and protective beside me. I looked at Darren crying silently on the couch, utterly abandoned by his wife and facing his own impending criminal investigation. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I did not feel a single twinge of guilt or hesitation. I looked at Vivian and saw the exact same woman who had mocked my miscarriage, who had cheered when her son abandoned me, who had spent the last hour actively trying to destroy my career and get me arrested simply for existing in her presence. I slowly reached down and firmly detached Vivian's shaking hands from my ankles. I took a step back, putting physical distance between myself and her desperate begging form. I looked her dead in the eyes and prepared to deliver the final absolute judgment she so richly deserved. You told me earlier today that leaving me was the best decision your son ever made, Vivian, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and entirely devoid of sympathy. I want you to remember those exact words right now, because you were absolutely right. Leaving me was the greatest thing Marcus could have ever done for my life. It removed the dead weight. It allowed me to build an empire without carrying a weak, insecure man on my back. But for him, leaving the only person who actually protected him from his own rampant stupidity was a fatal error. Vivian sobbed harder, her tears dropping onto the polished marble floor. You cannot do this, Maya, she begged, her voice cracking with raw, pathetic desperation. You are a good person. You are a Christian woman. Please do not let my son go to a federal prison. He will not survive a place like that. They will destroy him. I am not sending him to prison, Vivian, I replied, staring down at her ruined emerald green dress. His own arrogance and his own insatiable greed sent him there. You raised a man who believed he was entitled to the world without having to work for a single piece of it. You taught him that appearances matter more than integrity. You built this exact moment. You laid every single brick of his federal prison cell with your own 2 hands by rewarding his deceit and celebrating his betrayals. Darren tried to step forward, but the sheer intimidating presence of Julian Pierce standing right beside me forced him to stay back. Maya, please, Darren, pleaded, his voice lacking any of its former elite authority. The family name will be completely ruined. The legacy will be entirely wiped out. We will lose our memberships, our business partners, our friends. The legacy is a fraud, Darren, I stated coldly. Chloe saw it and ran. She recognized the sinking ship and abandoned you. The second she realized your money was an illusion. You are the only one left standing in the burning house because you are too foolish to find the exit. You and your mother are going to have to learn how to live in the real world now. Vivian reached out again, but Julian smoothly stepped forward, using his physical presence to block her from touching me. Vivian fell back onto her heels, weeping openly. The surgery. Maya? Vivian wailed, pivoting her desperation back to the immediate medical crisis. He is on an operating table right now. He needs the VIP suite. He needs the top-tier surgeons to save his life. You cannot let him die just to punish me. I turned my attention away from the sobbing matriarch and looked at Mr. Sterling. The billing director stood perfectly at attention, his silver clipboard held professionally at his side. He stepped forward, awaiting my executive directive. Atlanta General Hospital is legally obligated to provide life-saving emergency care to any individual who arrives at our doors regardless of their financial status or criminal background. I announced, ensuring every person in the room heard the official policy. We will not let him die on the table. However, Marcus no longer possesses premium health insurance, his accounts are completely frozen, and he is officially a ward of the federal government, pending his physical recovery. I reached out and took the silver pen from Mr. Sterling. He held the clipboard up, presenting the administrative forms. Therefore, Marcus will receive the exact standard of care mandated by state law for an uninsured indigent patient. I declared, signing my name across the bottom line with smooth, precise strokes. He will be removed from the VIP cardiology wing immediately following his bypass procedure. He will not be placed in a private presidential recovery suite. He will be transferred to a standard multi-bed county recovery ward. He will receive the on-call surgical staff, not the premium private practice doctors. He will be treated exactly like the working-class people you have spent your entire miserable life looking down upon. Vivian let out a raw, piercing scream. The sound tore through the quiet lounge, a devastating, visceral howl of a woman who had just been stripped of her final shred of privilege. It was the absolute ultimate humiliation. Her golden boy, the son she treated like a literal god, was going to wake up handcuffed to a standard hospital bed, surrounded by federal agents and common patients. I handed the pen back to Mr. Sterling. Make sure the transfer is handled efficiently, I instructed the billing director. Mr. Sterling bowed his head slightly. Understood, Madam Chairwoman, he replied, turning on his heel to execute the orders. Julian placed a warm, protective hand on the small of my back. It is time to leave, Maya. Julian said, his voice deep and grounding. The acquisition gala begins in 1 hour, and the board of directors is waiting to celebrate your immense success. I nodded, leaning briefly into his supportive touch. I did not look down at Vivian again. I did not spare a single glance for Darren, who was currently staring at his dark phone screen in total catatonic shock. As Julian and I turned toward the heavy mahogany double doors, the sound of heavy tactical boots echoed down the corridor outside. The doors swung open and 6 federal agents wearing dark jackets with bold yellow lettering marched directly into the VIP lounge. The lead agent bypassed us completely and walked straight toward Darren, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. Darren Marcus, you are being detained for questioning regarding massive wire fraud and federal financial crimes, the agent announced, his voice loud and authoritative. I did not stay to watch them put the cuffs on my former brother-in-law. I walked through the double doors with Julian stepping out of the tense, suffocating atmosphere of the cardiology lounge and into the bright, clean air of the main hospital corridor. The frantic screams of Vivian begging the federal agents to leave her remaining son alone faded away as the heavy doors swung shut behind us, sealing them inside their own self-made hell. We walked out of the hospital and into the warm Atlanta evening. A sleek black town car was waiting for us at the curb. The driver opened the door and I slid into the luxurious leather interior. Julian sat beside me, taking my hand in his. The engine purred to life, and the car pulled away from the hospital, carrying me toward a future I had built with my own 2 hands. As we drove through the vibrant streets of Atlanta, I watched the city lights blur past the tinted windows. For 5 years, I had allowed that toxic family to convince me I was unworthy of respect. I had allowed their elite status and their cruel microaggressions to dictate my self-esteem. But sitting in the quiet luxury of the town car, holding the hand of a man who treated me as an equal, I felt a profound, absolute peace. The trauma they inflicted on me had not broken me. It had simply forged me into something entirely unbreakable. Marcus would spend the best years of his life locked in a concrete cell, stripped of his designer suits and his arrogant pride. Vivian would have to return to her elite country club circles and face the devastating public humiliation of being the mother of a convicted federal scammer. Chloe would undoubtedly drain Darren of whatever hidden assets remained during their bitter divorce, leaving him completely bankrupt. The scales of justice had not just been balanced today, they had been permanently shattered in my favor. I leaned my head against Julian's shoulder and closed my eyes, letting the sweet, magnificent silence of ultimate victory wash over me. I held the heavy leather portfolio in my lap, feeling the smooth, premium texture against my fingertips. Julian stood beside me like a formidable shield, his presence radiating an undeniable authority that had completely paralyzed every other person in the VIP lounge. He did not look at the frantic family standing just a few feet away. He kept his dark, piercing eyes locked entirely on me. The silence in the room was absolute and terrifying. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that precedes a catastrophic explosion. The security guards held their breath. The hospital billing director stood perfectly rigid, holding his clipboard. Julian adjusted his tailored midnight blue suit jacket and spoke. His voice was not loud, but it carried a deadly, precise resonance that sliced through the sterile air of the lounge and echoed off the polished marble walls. Madam Chairwoman, Julian stated, pronouncing the title with deliberate, unwavering respect. The final acquisition documents have been fully executed. The purchase of the Atlanta General Hospital Network by our healthcare venture capital firm is now 100% complete. You officially own this facility and its entire operating infrastructure. He paused, letting the monumental weight of that statement settle over the room before delivering the final fatal strike. Given the current medical crisis involving your former husband, Julian continued, his tone shifting to pure, ruthless business. I need your executive directive. How would you like to handle the patient, Marcus? The words dropped into the VIP lounge like heavy concrete blocks, completely shattering the last remaining fragments of Vivian's delusional world. The collective gasp from my former family was highly audible. It was a sharp, ragged intake of air, as the realization violently crashed down upon them with the unstoppable force of a freight train. The woman they had been aggressively mocking, the black woman they assumed was a low-level hospital clerk, fetching water and cleaning bedpans, was not just an executive. She was the absolute sole owner of the very building they were standing in. The premium VIP suite they were begging for the elite medical staff, they were demanding the very floors they were standing on, belonged entirely to me. I looked down at the leather-bound portfolio resting on my lap. The embossed gold lettering on the cover displayed the name of our venture capital firm, alongside the official seal of Atlanta General Hospital. It was the physical manifestation of 12 months of grueling, relentless work. While Marcus was busy stealing money to fund his lavish lifestyle with his new elite partner, I was strategically building an empire. While Vivian was busy slandering my name at her country club luncheons, I was orchestrating the largest healthcare acquisition in the state of Georgia. They had severely underestimated my intelligence and my drive, and now they were paying the absolute highest price for their bitter ignorance. Vivian stumbled backward, her legs finally giving out beneath her expensive emerald green dress. She collapsed heavily onto the adjacent leather sofa, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The perfectly maintained facade of the wealthy elite Atlanta matriarch was completely annihilated in a fraction of a second. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a horrific realization that she had just spent the last 20 minutes hurling racist and classist insults at a billionaire who literally held her son's life in her hands. Her brain actively, aggressively fought against the information. Vivian desperately wanted this to be a cruel joke, a misunderstanding or a hallucination brought on by the severe stress of Marcus collapsing. But Julian Pierce did not make jokes. The billionaire venture capitalist, standing as my equal and my protector, was a terrifying testament to a reality Vivian could no longer deny. She looked at the diamond Rolex gleaming on my wrist, and suddenly the puzzle pieces she had deliberately ignored slammed together. Darren looked absolutely terrified. The arrogant corporate executive who had threatened to have me dragged out by security was now trembling violently. His face drained of all color, transforming into a sickly, translucent pale shade. As a man who worked in finance, Darren understood exactly what an acquisition of a major hospital network entailed. He knew the sheer astronomical level of capital required to execute that kind of corporate buyout. He realized with devastating clarity that the wealth I controlled eclipsed his entire family legacy by hundreds of millions of dollars. Darren took a shaky step back, his expensive leather shoes scraping against the floor. He looked at Julian, then looked at me, and the reality of his own pathetic insignificance washed over him. The man who had mocked my background, who had called me bitter and obsessed, was now standing in a building I owned begging for his brother's life, while his own financial accounts were mysteriously frozen by federal agents. The horrifying connection between my supreme power and his sudden catastrophic financial ruin began to form in his frantic mind. Chloe was perhaps the most magnificent spectacle of destruction in the room. The blonde woman who had snapped her fingers in my face demanding sparkling water and expedited paperwork looked as though she had been physically struck by a heavy blunt object. Her blue eyes were blown wide with unadulterated primal terror. Chloe came from old Southern money. She had spent her entire life wielding her racial and classist privilege like a weapon, relying on the absolute certainty that she would always reside at the top of the social hierarchy. She had looked at a black woman in surgical scrubs and immediately categorized me as the help. Now that rigid, toxic worldview was aggressively flipping upside down and crushing her underneath it. The realization that she had openly mocked the natural hair and the professional status of a billionaire healthcare magnate triggered a visible physical reaction. Chloe dropped her designer smartphone. The device hit the marble floor with a sharp crack, the screen spiderwebbing into dozens of broken lines. She did not even attempt to pick it up. She shrank behind her husband, wrapping her arms around her own stomach, trying to make herself as physically small as possible to escape the crushing gravity of her monumental mistake. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I slowly stood up from the plush leather sofa, commanding the attention of every single person in the lounge. I smoothed the front of my cream-colored blazer and looked down at my dark navy surgical scrubs. "I am wearing these scrubs, Chloe," I said, my voice perfectly calm and incredibly cold, because I spent the last 3 hours personally inspecting the sterile environments of my newly acquired surgical wards. I wanted to ensure that the millions of dollars I am investing into this facility are being utilized to maintain the absolute highest standards of medical care. I do not fetch water. I do not clean floors. I buy the floors. I shifted my gaze to Vivian, who was trembling on the edge of the sofa, clutching her pearl necklace, as if it could somehow protect her from the absolute destruction of her ego. "And I certainly do not consider any of you to be my family," I continued, driving the final nail into the coffin of her arrogance. "You demanded to speak to the highest authority in this hospital, Vivian. You wanted to use your elite connections to have me destroyed and thrown out onto the street. Well, you are looking directly at the highest authority. I am the board. I am the ownership. And I am the woman who is going to decide exactly what happens to your precious golden boy today." The suffocating silence in the VIP lounge was broken only by the ragged, frantic breathing of my former in-laws. The absolute certainty of my statement hung in the air, a heavy, undeniable truth that crushed the remaining air from their lungs. Vivian remained completely paralyzed on the edge of the leather sofa, her manicured hands gripping the cushions as if the floor beneath her was actively giving way. Her carefully constructed elite universe had just been violently inverted. Chloe was the first to physically react. The arrogant blonde woman who had just minutes ago demanded I fetch her sparkling water while hurling racist microaggressions at my natural hair suddenly appeared physically ill. A deep, painful flush crept up her neck, consuming her face. She took a trembling step toward me, her hands raised in a desperate, placating gesture. Her southern drawl, usually dripping with condescension, now shook with pure, unadulterated terror. "Maya, please!" Chloe stammered, her voice cracking as she frantically tried to rewrite the last 20 minutes of her life. "You have to know I was just terribly upset about Marcus. The stress makes people say crazy things. I never meant any disrespect toward you or your position. You know I have always admired your drive. And your hair, I was just saying to Darren the other day how stunning your natural curls are. We are practically sisters, Maya. You cannot possibly take any of that silly bickering to heart." I turned my gaze slowly toward Chloe. The pathetic attempt to walk back her blatant bigotry was deeply embarrassing to witness. I did not blink. I did not offer her a single fraction of an inch of grace. "You do not get to play the sister card, Chloe," I said, my voice perfectly level, cutting through her frantic apologies like a scalpel. You felt entirely comfortable using your proximity to a wealthy black family to shield your own deeply ingrained prejudices. You looked at a black woman standing in a hospital, and your immediate instinct was to command me to fetch your beverages. You assumed I was uneducated. You assumed I was powerless. You assumed you could wield your privilege like a weapon without ever facing a single consequence. But your privilege holds absolutely zero currency in my building. Chloe shrank back, letting out a small, humiliated sob. She looked toward her husband for support, but Darren was entirely consumed by his own monumental catastrophe. Darren was staring at me with a look of abject, horrifying terror. The corporate bravado he had worn like a suit of armor had completely dissolved, leaving behind a weak, terrified man who suddenly understood the catastrophic magnitude of his mistake. He looked at the leather portfolio resting in my hands, the official document confirming my absolute ownership of the hospital network. He realized that the woman he had just threatened to throw out onto the street was the exact same woman who could single-handedly dismantle his entire financial existence. Darren swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly against his sweat-soaked collar. "Maya?" he whispered, his voice lacking any of its former booming authority. "Maya, I am so incredibly sorry. I was completely out of line. I was just trying to protect my mother. You know how she gets. But you cannot do this. You cannot let Marcus die just to prove a point. We will do whatever you want. We will issue a public apology. We will give you whatever you demand. Just please do not let my brother pay the price for our stupidity." I raised my hand, silencing his pathetic groveling. I stood tall, smoothing the front of my cream-colored blazer, and slowly ran my hands down the dark navy fabric of my surgical scrubs. I took a measured step toward them, ensuring they felt the full weight of my presence. "You spent the last half hour mocking these scrubs, Darren," I said, my tone casual, but laced with absolute lethal precision. "You and your mother assumed I was scrubbing toilets or emptying bedpans because your limited, arrogant minds could not comprehend my success. Let me clarify exactly why I am wearing this uniform today." I paced slowly across the marble floor, my sneakers making absolutely no sound, maintaining eye contact with the terrified family. "I am not wearing these scrubs because I clean this hospital," I explained, articulating every single syllable with chilling clarity. "I am wearing them because I spent the preceding 3 hours conducting a comprehensive physical inspection of the newly acquired sterile surgical wards. I was evaluating the multi-million-dollar upgrades my venture capital firm is actively funding to ensure this facility operates at the absolute pinnacle of global medical standards. I was walking through active operating theaters, dictating the financial future of hundreds of elite surgeons and medical staff. I am wearing these scrubs because I am the architect of this entire medical network." Vivian let out a strangled, pathetic whimper. The realization that she had openly ridiculed the billionaire owner of the hospital for wearing the uniform of her own empire completely broke her mind. She looked up at me, her eyes bloodshot and pleading, stripped entirely of her country club arrogance. "You thought you could diminish me, Vivian," I continued, turning my focus entirely onto the weeping matriarch. "You thought you could humiliate me by reducing my worth to my clothing and my background. But the reality is that I do not need a designer dress or an exclusive black card to prove my power. I hold the deed to this hospital. I control the board of directors. I sign the paychecks of the doctors who are currently trying to keep your fraudulent, lying son alive." The air in the VIP lounge felt incredibly thin. The sheer gravity of my status had aggressively pinned them to the floor. They were drowning in the catastrophic consequences of their own toxic bigotry. "And as for your frantic, desperate apologies," I added, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet volume, "they mean absolutely nothing to me. You are not sorry for what you said. You are only sorry that you said it to a billionaire. If I were truly a janitor or a receptionist, you would have happily destroyed my livelihood without a second thought. You are only apologizing to my bank account." Darren opened his mouth to protest, but the devastating accuracy of my statement paralyzed his vocal cords. He looked down at his expensive Italian leather shoes, utterly defeated. Chloe covered her face with her trembling hands, actively weeping as the reality of her shattered social standing crashed over her. I looked at Julian, who stood perfectly still, a silent, formidable guardian watching me dismantle the people who had tortured me for 5 years. He offered me a single slow nod of absolute respect and solidarity. The dynamic was completely, permanently shifted. I was no longer the vulnerable girl desperate for their approval. I was the absolute, undeniable master of their fate. I stepped back, returning to the center of the lounge. The psychological devastation was complete. They had walked into this hospital acting like untouchable royalty, and within minutes, I had stripped them of their wealth, their pride, and their fundamental sense of reality. The illusion they had so desperately clung to was pulverized, leaving them entirely exposed and deeply pathetic. They were completely at my mercy, and they knew with terrifying certainty that I possessed absolutely none. The silence in the lounge was absolute and heavy, holding the crushing weight of their shattered reality. Julian shifted his stance smoothly, taking command of the room with the effortless grace of a man who destroyed empires before breakfast. He looked down at Vivian, who was still trembling on the floor, and then shifted his dark, predatory gaze to Darren. "It is time to address the magnificent delusion your family has been operating under," Julian stated, his voice resonating with cold corporate authority. "You walked in here boasting about Marcus closing a massive 6-figure deal this afternoon. You bragged about his upcoming mansion in Buckhead and his elite banking family connections. Let me illuminate the actual source of your brother's highly fabricated success." Darren swallowed hard, wiping a bead of cold sweat from his pale forehead. He looked completely sick to his stomach, instinctively knowing that whatever Julian was about to say would seal his permanent financial doom. "Marcus is not a financial prodigy?" Julian continued, pacing slowly across the polished marble floor. "He is a desperate, highly incompetent criminal. For the past 3 years, he has been running an aggressive multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme. He never invested a single dime of his clients' capital into legitimate markets. He actively stole funds from new investors to pay off the old ones, skimming massive percentages off the top to fund his designer suits, his luxury cars, and the breathtakingly expensive lifestyle of his new privileged mistress." Vivian gasped, pressing her manicured hands over her mouth, as if trying to physically force the words back into the air. "That is a lie," she whimpered, her voice cracking with pathetic desperation. "My son is a legitimate broker. The market is just volatile right now. You are trying to frame him." "He framed himself." Vivian Y interjected, my voice slicing through her denial like a surgical blade. "Marcus built a fragile house of cards, and it was bound to collapse the moment a single investor asked for a significant withdrawal. He was bleeding cash. His new elite partner demanded a standard of living he could not legitimately afford. The country club dues, the private jet charters, the down payment on that spectacular Buckhead mansion, it was all financed by stolen money. He was drowning in massive, suffocating debt." Julian stopped pacing and stood directly in front of the terrified brother. Darren shrank back into the leather sofa, his entire body shaking. 3 months ago, Marcus realized his massive fraud was on the absolute brink of exposure, Julian explained, locking eyes with Darren. He needed an immediate, catastrophic influx of capital to cover a $50 million shortfall before his primary investors demanded an audit. In a move of spectacular stupidity, Marcus submitted a fraudulent funding proposal to an elite private equity firm begging for a corporate bailout. He falsified 3 years of financial records, hoping the firm would swallow his lies and cut him a massive check to save his miserable life. Darren let out a harsh, ragged breath, his hands gripping his knees. He knew exactly what proposal Julian was talking about. He had likely helped Marcus falsify those very documents. "Which firm?" Darren choked out, his voice barely a whisper. "Which equity firm did he solicit?" Julian smiled. It was a terrifying, predatory expression that contained absolutely zero warmth. "He submitted his fraudulent portfolio to Apex Vanguard Holdings." Julian revealed, his tone dropping into a deadly quiet register. "It is one of the most aggressive and highly capitalized private equity funds on the eastern seaboard." The color drained completely from Darren's face, leaving him looking like a polished corpse. He recognized the name of the firm immediately. It was an industry titan. But the fatal, devastating twist was still waiting to be delivered. Apex Vanguard Holdings is not an independent entity, Julian stated smoothly, straightening his bespoke suit jacket. It is a direct subsidiary network. It is entirely owned and operated by our primary venture capital conglomerate. Julian turned his head slowly, looking directly at me with profound respect, and the majority shareholder, the chief executive officer, who personally reviews every single major funding acquisition for that specific subsidiary, is the woman standing right in front of you. The air was instantly sucked out of the VIP lounge. The sheer astronomical magnitude of the irony crashed over the broken family. Marcus had desperately tried to scam the exact woman he had betrayed and discarded. I took a step forward, looking directly down at Vivian, who was weeping silently on the marble tile. Your golden boy sent his fraudulent financial records directly to my desk, Vivian. I said, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of a single ounce of mercy. He packaged all his desperate, pathetic lies into a neat little portfolio and submitted it to my company. When my risk assessment team flagged the proposal for inconsistencies, I personally reviewed the files. I recognized his amateur accounting tricks immediately. I saw exactly how he was moving stolen capital to fund his elite lifestyle with his banking heiress girlfriend. Vivian let out a strangled, horrifying sob, shaking her head back and forth as if the motion could somehow negate the truth. I did not just reject his desperate plea for a bailout. I continued delivering the final crushing blow to her matriarchal pride. I compiled every single falsified document, every fake bank statement, and every trace of his extensive wire fraud. At exactly 6 o'clock this morning, I personally handed that complete, undeniable dossier directly to the regional director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I triggered the federal raid that hit his corporate lobby. I am the reason his accounts were frozen. I am the reason he collapsed in terror on his office floor. Darren let out a loud, agonizing groan, burying his face in his trembling hands. The absolute certainty of federal prison loomed over him, a dark, inescapable shadow cast by his brother's staggering incompetence. He thought he could discard me because I lacked your elite pedigree, Vivian, I said, staring down at the ruined woman. He thought I was just a naive girl he could replace with a wealthier model. But his sheer arrogance blinded him to his own monumental stupidity. He walked his entire criminal enterprise right into the palm of my hand. I did not even have to hunt him down. He actively, aggressively brought his own destruction directly to my doorstep. The room remained suspended in a state of absolute catatonic shock. The wealthy, powerful family had been completely outmaneuvered, outplayed, and outclassed in every conceivable metric. They were entirely ruined, financially, legally, and socially, and they were looking directly at the architect of their total annihilation. Julian checked his custom timepiece. He fixed his unyielding gaze on Darren. Just to ensure you fully comprehend the absolute severity of your current timeline, Julian stated, his voice maintaining a smooth, terrifying equilibrium. The federal agents who raided your brother's corporate lobby did not stop there. They are currently occupying the surgical recovery floor of this very building. I authorized their unrestricted access to the medical wing 20 minutes ago. Darren let out a sharp wheeze, clutching his chest as if experiencing his own cardiac event. The absolute second the anesthesia wears off, Julian continued, he will not be greeted by his mother. He will be greeted by armed federal marshals. They have orders to handcuff him to the steel rails of his recovery bed the instant he opens his eyes. He is officially a ward of the state and will be transferred to a federal holding facility the moment his heart is stable. Chloe stood entirely frozen near the mahogany reception desk. Her expensive designer tote bag dangled limply from her trembling fingers. The woman had spent the last 2 years bathing in the overflow of Marcus' stolen wealth. She had eagerly attended the country club galas, sipped premium champagne, and actively participated in the relentless mockery of my working-class background. But Chloe possessed a ruthless survival instinct born from generations of old Southern money. Her family valued their pristine public reputation above absolutely everything else, including the sacred vows of marriage. The horrifying reality of Julian's words aggressively rewired her brain. She looked at her husband, Darren. The man she married for his supposed financial pedigree was now sweating profusely, muttering incoherently to himself, and facing imminent federal indictment as a co-signer on a massive Ponzi scheme. Chloe realized with terrifying clarity that the federal asset freeze currently locking her personal accounts was only the beginning. The FBI would inevitably trace the stolen corporate funds directly to her own luxury purchases. Her family name would be dragged through the mud and plastered across every evening news broadcast in Atlanta as accomplices to a devastating financial crime. Her survival instinct violently overrode any lingering shred of marital loyalty. The manicured Southern Belle mask completely disintegrated. Chloe violently shoved her smartphone deep into her leather tote bag and zipped it shut with an aggressive, jagged motion. She took 3 rapid steps away from Darren, physically and symbolically distancing herself from the radioactive fallout of his ruined family name. "Are you completely out of your mind?" Chloe shrieked, pointing a shaking, accusatory finger directly at her husband. Her high-pitched voice shattered the quiet atmosphere of the lounge. "You told me your brother was a certified financial genius. You looked me dead in the eyes and promised me your family investment firm was completely bulletproof. You tied our joint accounts to his holding company's Darren. You willingly, eagerly linked my pristine family name to a pathetic federal Ponzi scheme just to stroke your own massive, fragile ego." Darren looked up, his face slick with cold, clammy sweat. "Chloe, please," he begged, raising his shaking hands in a pathetic attempt to calm her down. "We can figure this out together." I had absolutely no idea what he was doing behind closed doors. I swear to God, I had no idea Marcus was faking those portfolios. We just need to hire the right defense lawyers and legally distance ourselves from his operations before the indictments drop. "You are going to hire high-powered defense lawyers with what money?" Chloe laughed, a harsh, hysterical sound that scraped against the marble walls like broken glass. "Your accounts are frozen, Darren. My accounts are frozen. The FBI is literally standing outside an operating room right now, waiting to drag your brother to prison, and you genuinely want me to stick around and figure it out with you? Absolutely not. I am not spending a single night in a federal penitentiary because your entire family consists of arrogant criminal failures." Vivian gasped, pressing a trembling hand to her pearl necklace. "Chloe, how dare you speak to your husband this way?" Vivian cried desperately, trying to summon her broken matriarchal authority. "We are family. We have to stand united against these horrific accusations." "Shut your mouth, Vivian," Chloe snapped, turning her vicious elite entitlement fully onto her weeping mother-in-law. "Just shut your mouth for one single second. This entire catastrophic nightmare is your fault. You raised 2 pathetic, incompetent sons and spent your entire miserable life pretending they were actual gods. You aggressively pushed Marcus to live completely beyond his means just so you could brag to your pathetic little country club friends. Well, look closely at your precious golden boy now, Vivian. He is a broke federal criminal dying on an operating table, and your precious family legacy is absolute toxic garbage." Darren stood up, trying to grab his wife's arm. "Chloe, please stop it," he pleaded, tears welling in his eyes. "Do not touch me!" Chloe screamed, jerking her arm away with violent, undisguised disgust. "I am leaving this hospital right now. I am calling my father from the lobby and having his legal team draft divorce papers before the end of the business day. I am filing for an immediate emergency separation of assets, and I am going to make absolutely sure the federal government knows I had zero involvement in your pathetic family financial crimes. Have a nice life in prison, Darren." Chloe turned on her expensive heels and marched directly toward the heavy mahogany doors. She did not ever look back, even once. She did not ever spare a single sympathetic glance at the weeping matriarch or her hyperventilating soon-to-be ex-husband. The heavy doors swung shut behind her with a definitive booming thud, sealing the permanent fracture of their elite family structure. The panicked rats were actively fleeing the rapidly sinking ship, and Chloe had proudly led the absolute undeniable charge out of the facility. The heavy mahogany doors slammed shut with a reverberating boom that seemed to shake the very foundation of the VIP lounge. The sharp, aggressive click of the brass latch locking into place sounded like a definitive gavel strike, sealing the absolute doom of the Marcus family legacy. Darren let out a hollow, ragged wheeze. He slumped sideways on the plush leather sofa, pulling his knees tightly toward his chest and burying his tear-streaked face into the expensive upholstery. The former corporate titan was completely reduced to a shivering, broken shell of a man entirely paralyzed by the catastrophic loss of his wife, his wealth, and his freedom. He did not make another sound, simply vibrating with silent, suffocating panic. Vivian stood entirely alone in the center of the polished marble floor. The majestic matriarch of the Atlanta elite was completely stripped of her toxic armor. Her breathing was erratic, her chest heaving violently beneath her ruined emerald green dress. She stared at the closed doors for a long, agonizing moment, as if hoping Chloe would suddenly burst back into the room and declare the entire nightmare a cruel practical joke. But the doors remained perfectly still. The silence in the lounge grew impossibly heavy, pressing down on Vivian's shoulders with the crushing gravitational force of her own monumental failures. Slowly, agonizingly, Vivian turned her bloodshot eyes back toward me. The vicious, arrogant spark that had fueled her relentless bullying for the past 5 years was entirely extinguished. In its place was a raw, primal desperation that was almost difficult to look at. She was staring at the exact same black woman she had aggressively mocked just 30 minutes ago, but now she was looking at me as if I were the absolute center of the universe, the sole remaining deity capable of granting her salvation. Her knees buckled. It was not a graceful descent. Vivian collapsed violently, her shins hitting the hard marble floor with a sharp, painful thud. The pristine fabric of her designer dress pooled around her trembling legs. She let out a guttural, devastating sob, throwing her hands forward to catch her weight. Her expensive pearl necklace swung wildly, clacking against the cold tile. The powerful, untouchable queen of the country club elite was actively crawling across the floor toward my sneakers, her dignity completely eradicated by her blinding terror. "Maya, please," Vivian wept, her voice cracking and splitting into a pathetic, raspy whine. "Please, I am begging you on my hands and knees. Look at me, Maya. I am crawling to you. You cannot let them take my boy. You cannot let those federal agents drag him out of his recovery bed and throw him into a concrete cell. He is 34 years old, Maya. He is so young, he is weak. He will not survive a place like that. They will absolutely destroy him." She reached out her trembling manicured fingers, frantically grasping at the air just inches from my shoes. I took a slow, deliberate step backward, ensuring she could not lay a single hand on the fabric of my scrubs. Julian immediately shifted his stance, moving half a step forward to physically block her path, his dark eyes glaring down at the weeping woman with profound disgust. Vivian did not care about the rejection. She simply dragged herself forward again, her tears leaving dark, wet streaks across the pristine hospital floor. "You have all the power now," Vivian pleaded, her voice rising into a hysterical, frantic pitch. "You own this entire hospital network, Maya. You are a billionaire. You have armies of lawyers. You control the holding company that Marcus took the money from. You can stop this right now. You can walk out to those federal agents and tell them it was a massive misunderstanding. You can drop the corporate charges. You can waive the surgical deposit and transfer him to a private offshore recovery clinic before they even know he is awake. You have the resources to hide him, Maya. I know you do. I will do anything you ask. I will publicly apologize. I will sign over the deed to my house. Just name your price and save my son." I stared down at the pathetic, groveling woman. My expression remained entirely unchanged, a mask of cold, impenetrable calm. "You are asking me to commit federal obstruction of justice, to harbor a fugitive who stole millions of dollars to fund his new mistress's luxury lifestyle, Vivian." I stated, my voice perfectly level, slicing through her hysterical sobbing. "You are begging me to risk my empire, my freedom, and my pristine corporate reputation to save a man who abandoned me in this exact same hospital while I was bleeding from a miscarriage." Vivian choked on a sob, aggressively shaking her head back and forth as if physical denial could somehow rewrite their horrific history. "I know we were cruel, Maya. Vivian cried out, clasping her hands together in a desperate prayer. I know I said unforgivable things to you today. I was blind and arrogant and so incredibly wrong about your worth. But you are a good Christian woman. You have a beautiful, forgiving heart. You cannot condemn a man to death in a federal penitentiary out of spite. Please, Maya, we used to be family. I loved you like my own daughter. The sheer astronomical audacity of that statement hung in the air, a toxic cloud of pure, unadulterated manipulation. She had weaponized the word family. She had dared to invoke a fabricated love to save her criminal son. I felt Julian tense beside me, the muscles in his jaw ticking as he registered the profound, sickening hypocrisy of her plea. I gently placed my hand on Julian's arm, a silent signal that I required absolutely no assistance to dismantle this pathetic display. I stepped out from behind Julian's protective shadow, closing the distance, until I was standing directly over the weeping matriarch. I looked down into her bloodshot, desperate eyes, refusing to offer her a single fraction of an inch of mercy. We were never family. Vivian, I said, my voice dropping into a deadly quiet register that commanded the absolute attention of the room. When I was married to your son, you treated me like a disease. You used every family dinner, every holiday, every social gathering to remind me that my blackness, my natural hair, and my working-class background made me an inferior species. You actively celebrated when Marcus betrayed me. You popped premium champagne when he filed the divorce papers. You stood in this exact room 20 minutes ago and called me a worthless nobody fetching coffee in cheap scrubs. Vivian clamped her hands over her ears, squeezing her eyes shut as if trying to block out the devastating truth of her own actions. Do not dare invoke the word family now that you are completely bankrupt and terrified. I continued, pronouncing every syllable with ruthless precision. Do not dare pretend you ever loved me like a daughter, just because you discovered I have the power to obliterate your entire existence. You do not love me, Vivian. You love my bank account. You love the federal influence I wield. You are not apologizing to Maya the woman. You are actively groveling at the feet of Madam Chairwoman the billionaire. And I am fundamentally immune to your fake, pathetic tears. Please. Vivian wailed, slamming her palms against the marble tile, her entire body racked with violent, uncontrollable shudders. Have mercy, Maya. I am a mother begging for the life of her child. I looked at her ruined, tear-stained face, completely devoid of its former elite arrogance. I did not feel pity. I did not feel an ounce of the familiar guilt that used to control my every action. I felt nothing but the pure, unadulterated clarity of a woman who had finally permanently severed the heavy toxic chains of her past. I looked down at the ruined woman weeping on the polished marble floor. Vivian had spent 5 years treating me like a disease, an infestation she needed to eradicate from her pristine bloodline. She had deployed every ounce of her social capital to make me feel small, insignificant, and entirely disposable. Now the grand matriarch of the Atlanta elite was reduced to a shivering, pathetic mess, begging for my mercy. Her expensive emerald green dress was soaked with her own tears, her carefully styled hair completely unraveled and hanging in damp clumps around her flushed face. I did not feel a single flicker of pity. I did not feel the slightest urge to reach out and offer her a comforting hand. The empathy that used to govern my every action, the desperate need to be accepted and loved by this family, had been systematically burned out of me. They had incinerated my compassion, leaving behind only cold, calculated business acumen. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the heavy silence of the VIP lounge stretch and pull until it felt like the air itself might shatter. I slowly bent my knees, lowering my body with smooth, controlled grace until I was hovering just inches above Vivian's tear-streaked face. The sudden proximity caused her to gasp. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a frantic, desperate hope, believing that my movement signaled forgiveness. She genuinely thought she had successfully manipulated me with her pathetic display of maternal grief. She reached out her trembling fingers, brushing the dark navy fabric of my surgical scrubs. I did not pull away. I simply looked directly into her bloodshot eyes, allowing her to see the absolute terrifying emptiness staring back at her. "You walked into this lounge today, Vivian." I began, my voice dropping into a deadly quiet whisper that forced her to strain to hear every single syllable. "You looked at me standing at the reception desk and you delivered a statement you believed would crush my spirit. Do you remember what you said?" Vivian shook her head frantically, tears spilling over her eyelashes and cutting clean paths through her ruined makeup. "No, Maya, please," she sobbed, her voice cracking. "I was angry. I was not thinking clearly. You said that leaving me was the best decision your son ever made." I continued, refusing to let her escape the reality of her own toxic cruelty. "You bragged about his massive success. You gloated about his new elite partner and his upcoming mansion in Buckhead. You looked me dead in the eyes and thanked God that he had finally dropped the dead weight so he could ascend to the absolute pinnacle of high society." Vivian squeezed her eyes shut, letting out a wretched, agonized wail. "Please stop," she begged. "I was wrong. I was so incredibly wrong." I leaned in even closer until my face was merely an inch from hers. The faint scent of her expensive floral perfume was completely overpowered by the sharp, sour stench of her sheer panic. "You are not wrong, Vivian." I whispered the words sliding off my tongue with lethal precision. "You were absolutely entirely right. Leaving me was the best decision Marcus ever made." Vivian opened her eyes, confusion temporarily piercing through her blinding terror. She stared at me uncomprehending. "Leaving me was the best decision he ever made, because it led me directly to my empire." I stated, my voice solidifying into pure iron, "and it led him directly to a federal prison cell." The words struck her like a physical execution. The brutal, undeniable poetry of the statement hit Vivian with catastrophic force. She let out a sharp, suffocated gasp as the reality of my words tore through her chest. If Marcus had stayed with me, I would have spent the rest of my life shrinking myself to accommodate his massive, fragile ego. I would have drained my own brilliant potential trying to save a man who was fundamentally committed to his own destruction. His betrayal was the catalyst that set me completely free. His cruelty was the exact fuel I used to build a venture capital firm that now possessed the absolute power to crush his entire existence. "You are asking me to save him." I continued, straightening my posture slightly, looking down at her trembling hands. "You are begging me to use my wealth, my corporate influence, and my private medical facilities to harbor a federal fugitive. You are asking me to protect a man who stole millions of dollars from innocent investors to fund his reckless arrogance. But you seem to be forgetting a very crucial fundamental fact about who I am now. I am a businesswoman, Vivian. I am not a charity." Vivian let out a strangled gasp, clutching at her own throat as the absolute finality of my statement began to suffocate her. "You are demanding that I make a multi-million-dollar investment to bail out a failed, fraudulent asset," I explained, translating her desperate emotional pleas into cold, hard corporate terminology. "Marcus is a toxic liability. He possesses absolutely zero value. He brings nothing to the table but massive federal indictments and catastrophic public humiliation. Any intelligent investor would look at his portfolio and immediately liquidate the asset. I am simply executing standard business protocol. I am liquidating a bad investment." "But he is a human being!" Vivian shrieked, pounding her fists against the marble floor in a sudden, explosive burst of violent denial. "He is your former husband. He is my son. You cannot just write him off like a bad check." "I can, and I already have," I replied, my voice echoing with unyielding authority. "You taught me this exact lesson, Vivian. You spent 5 years demonstrating exactly how this elite world operates. You taught me that value is determined by capital, by leverage, and by absolute power. You showed me that compassion is a weakness to be exploited. I was an excellent student, Vivian. I learned every single ruthless lesson you threw at me. And now I am applying your exact methodology to your own family." Darren, who had been sobbing silently on the leather sofa, suddenly raised his head. His eyes were completely hollow, entirely drained of the arrogant entitlement he had wielded earlier. He looked at his mother writhing on the floor, and then looked at me. The realization had finally completely solidified in his frantic mind. There was no secret loophole. There was no hidden mercy waiting to be uncovered. They were facing absolute total annihilation. Maya Darren whispered, his voice completely broken. Please, just please. I did not look at him. I kept my gaze locked firmly on the weeping matriarch at my feet. The empire I built requires ruthless calculation, I stated, delivering my final, absolute judgment. Saving Marcus would require me to sacrifice my integrity, my federal standing, and my corporate reputation. I am not willing to spend a single dime of my hard-earned wealth to rescue a man who left me bleeding in a hospital bed. I am completely finished subsidizing the failures of your pathetic family. I slowly stood up to my full height, towering over the ruined woman. I smoothed the lapels of my cream-colored blazer, the motion sharp and definitive. I had delivered the absolute crushing truth. I had stripped away every single layer of their delusion and forced them to look directly at the horrifying reality of their own monumental consequences. There was absolutely nothing left to say.